Hello, everybody, and welcome to Freud's Funky Findings podcast. My name is Borka Devai, and I'm a psychology student at Humboldt-University of Berlin, currently in my first semester. So I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I'm by no means a scientist or qualified expert of psychology. Not exactly sure what I'm doing. 3 times out of 10, I put face cream on my toothbrush in the morning. So my goal for this podcasting endeavor is basically to tell you, like, from friend to friend, what the adults are talking about, slash, what I've learned as a brand new psychology student recently. I'm from Hungary, but moved to Berlin when I was little. And so the reason I'm doing this thing in English is so that all my mom's Hungarian friends, who will probably make up 90% of the listeners, the 2 German students I talked to once in the canteen, and the one kid who just wanted to listen to a Drake song and clicked on this by accident, can all equally indulge in the load of scientific knowledge that's about to come their way, along with the several Eastern European childhood anecdotes that no one has ever asked for. I know you probably clicked on here to get answers to the most burning questions concerning the human psyche, like why are millennial parents naming their kids things like Juniper or Vidura? What explains the obsession 60-plus-year-old men have with wearing Speedos? And why did that one guy have no fear of eating week old macaroni from the fridge whilst being terrified to call you his girlfriend? Well, we will get there eventually, I promise. But before we do, let me introduce you to all the different areas, the different subjects that I'll be diving into head first this semester, and that consequentially you'll be diving into with me. These will be general psychology, biological psychology, social psychology, differential psychology, and pedagogy, and statistics. But here we're trying to inform about trauma, not cause it, so I'll leave that one be. And each episode is going to cover either one of these areas, so I'll make separate playlists for each as well. And in this first episode, we'll be tackling an introduction into general psychology. As the name indicates, this area of psychology explores what it is that generally makes up the human psyche. Instead of looking at individual cases, it focuses on what we all have in common. And the answer is, well, very goddamn little, at least if our concept of psychology is limited to dealing with complexes, childhood traumas, relationships, hopes, and dreams, what you tend to talk about with a therapist, because all of these things are typically tied to a distinct lived experience and are therefore more so subjects of differential psychology. Where we do, however, share a lot more across the board is actually in our biological makeup. In this case, not referring to the naturally sourced eyeshadow that I know we all have in our beauty cupboard, but more so to the like 99% identicality in our DNA, which leads to the fact that we as humans have massive commonalities when it comes to the mechanisms involved in basic mental operations, like cognition, emotion, memory, motivation, etc. So, what we feel and think and want is, of course, very different, but how we do the feeling, the thinking, and the wanting is actually quite similar. So, the concepts we'll be discussing on here first are probably going to seem a bit heavy on the biology and a bit less heavy on the did his mom force feed him broccoli growing up, or is he really just a bloody asshole? But that's why for the first episode I wanted to start off with something equally essential but possibly more relatable, which is the topic of personality. To be more specific, I'm gonna try to scratch the surface of this monster of a topic by introducing you to the model of the Big Five. So, personality has been a key topic of human life like forever. The Greeks with the charming hair already said charming things about it, like Socrates back in the 6th century before Christ, who said, Know thyself. That was my impression of an ancient Greek. But yeah, I think who am I is one of the first great questions we ever ask ourselves, and it accompanies us for most of our lives. And it's not just a private concern, because I think it's quite clear that our perception of ourselves influences how we carry ourselves in the world and interact with our surroundings too. To give you a rather illustrative example, in my neighborhood, we have a fox guy, like an adult man regularly seen wearing a full body fox costume and riding his bicycle. And then when he sees people staring at him, he greets them making fox sounds. I live in Berlin, by the way, so this is quite normal. Obviously, Fox Guy is slightly ludicrous, but in his shining moments, he might actually find peace thinking of himself as a fox. For whatever mystifying reason, he feels like his authentic self doing this. So we, the poor folk on our way to our weekly grocery shop at Netto, get to perceive him in all his orange glory and wonder if that's actually the sound that foxes make. What I meant to say by all this is that personality has a lot to do with subjective self-imagery, but also impacts how we navigate ourselves in the outside world. A couple of observable things that can reflect personality are, for example, ambitions, attitudes, and behavior, or even more tangible, way of speaking, fashion, hobbies, social circles, decoration of personal space, music taste, and so on and so forth. Now, the psychological definition of personality taught to us at uni is relatively stable patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that characterize a person across time and situations. It's like a consistent tendency to react in similar ways under similar circumstances. This means that while a person's behavior may vary depending on the context, there are certain lasting tendencies that distinguish one individual from another. So, there we might have outlined what personality generally entails, but because of this huge component of subjectivity, the question remains how the hell we can measure it. Many smart people thought about this for many years, and eventually arose the idea to use language to describe certain traits that point in a certain direction when it comes to personality. This was the so called lexical approach, which suggests that the most significant personality traits are encoded in a language's natural vocabulary. So, in order to learn more about the fundamental dimensions of personality, researchers started analyzing adjectives that describe personality characteristics across different languages. Basically, they took a gigantic number of adjectives and tried to build groups out of the ones that described personality in similar ways. And then they tried to identify what it is that they all have in common, meaning what are the broad, fundamental personality traits each of these groups describe. This method of condensing many variables into just a couple is called factor analysis. And using this method, researchers such as Raymond Cattell from the UK and later Warren Norman, as well as Paul Costa and Robert McRae, found five broad and stable dimensions, now known as the Big Five personality traits. So, all of the analyzed adjectives described either one of the following five personality traits: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, or neuroticism, hence the commonly used acronym OCEAN. The idea is that each of these five traits represents a spectrum rather than a binary category. So every person falls somewhere between the two opposing poles of each trait. So the combination of the scores on each trait provides a quite comprehensive description of one's personality. Now let's have a closer look at what they all mean. First, we have openness to experience. This describes the extent to which a person is explorative, curious, imaginative, and receptive to new ideas and experiences. Individuals high in openness tend to appreciate art, adventure, unconventional ideas, and variety. They're often intellectually curious and very creative thinkers. Opposing to that, people low in openness tend to prefer routine, familiarity, and often traditional values. Next up, we have conscientiousness. This refers to self discipline, organization, reliability, and a strong sense of duty. Conscientious individuals are typically very systematic, punctual, and goal oriented. They tend to plan ahead, abide by the rules, and work resiliently toward long term goals. People at the opposite end of the spectrum have a tendency to be more spontaneous, careless, or even disorganized. Third, we have extroversion. This might be a more popular term, which reflects the tendency or willingness to be outgoing, assertive, sociable, energetic, and talkative. Extroverts are oriented toward the external world, enjoying social interactions and stimulating settings. At the opposite end lies introversion, which is associated with being reserved, quiet, and more reflective or inwardly focused. That doesn't necessarily make people who are introverts shy, just more prone to prefer calm and less stimulating environments. Next up, we have agreeableness. This involves traits such as selflessness, trust, kindness, empathy, and cooperation. Those high in agreeableness are typically compassionate, warm, and striving to maintain positive social relationships. They value harmony and are motivated to help others. At the other end of this spectrum are people who may be more competitive, skeptical, or even antagonistic. And finally, neuroticism. This term describes the degree to which people experience and deal with negative emotions such as anxiety, sadness, tension, and insecurity. Individuals high in neuroticism are more likely to perceive situations as threatening and experience emotional instability or stress. They may struggle to control their impulses and to cope effectively with difficult situations. The opposite of this condition would be emotional stability, characterized by calmness, rationality, and low levels of negative affect. Now, you might be thinking, how could these five traits possibly reflect the personality of a human in all of its complexity? If I say I'm kind of open, somewhat conscientious, a little extroverted, potentially agreeable, and mildly neurotic, how are you supposed to know that my comfort meal is Hungarian bean stew with sour cream, that I get my most competitive playing Uno with my little brother, and feel oddly attracted to the actor of Mr. Bean after having listened to him speak so very eloquently in an interview from the 90s? My response here would be that your score on the Big Five is more like a model that's a simplified code for all the facets of your personality. It's like zooming out to get a less detailed, more compact overview. But it doesn't necessarily work the other way around, as the scores you have on a specific trait could have resulted from various sub-elements of that same trait. So, for example, you might get a high score on agreeableness, but if you want to zoom back in, you might not be able to know if that's because you're very polite or because you're very compassionate. The Big Five personality model has faced several criticisms despite its widespread acceptance. One major critique is that it lacks theoretical profoundness. It effectively describes personality traits without explaining where they're coming from. Moreover, the model has been accused of cultural bias, as it was mainly developed examining languages of Western societies and may therefore not equally capture personality structures found in non Western cultures. For example, Fanny M. Chung and Kwok Leung identified the aspect of interpersonal relatedness in Chinese samples, which is not included in the Big Five. On a similar note, Others have also articulated that the model does not cover important aspects of personality, which led Michael C. Ashton and Kibyom Lee to propose a model that adds a sixth factor: honesty, humility. Finally, the model relies heavily on self report questionnaires, which can be affected by social desirability and limited self awareness, thereby reducing the accuracy of personality assessments. Though here I'd like to add my own 2 cents in and say a huge portion of the topics psychologists are interested in, such as emotion, perception, memory, etc., can only be directly accessed through self assessment because of their subjective nature. So the risk of reduced accuracy is always going to be there, at least till the robots can finally learn to read our mind, and then we don't have to deal with this nonsense anymore. On that bright and optimistic note, I officially declare this episode concluded. I hope you enjoyed and that you are now somewhat familiar with the term Big Five. If you wish to further introspect and examine yourself, the What Pasta Shape Am I personality tests are, in my experience, very insightful. I got Maffaline, which is coincidentally exactly what my hair looks like. So, yeah, thank you for listening, and I hope to see you next time. Bye bye.